You are listening to the Prepared School Psych podcast, where we provide actionable insights, interview field experts, and introduce tools designed for school psychologists. Today, I am happy to introduce our guest, Tracie Hewitt. Tracie is a licensed educational psychologist and certified parenting coach with a master's degree in educational psychology from the University of Northern Colorado. With over 20 years of experience as a school psychologist, parent, and business owner, Tracie provides private assessments, counseling, and coaching. She helps parents navigate the complex stages of child development, addressing behavioral and social emotional needs with a practical, strengths-based approach. Tracie believes there are many effective ways to parent and few ways to do it wrong, and empowers families to find their own best path. Her philosophy centers on the idea that people who can do, focusing on building skills in emotional and behavioral regulation. Tracie's insights guide parents in creating resilient relationships with their children while navigating the challenges of modern parenting. I am very honored to have you here, Tracie. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, as you know, we like to kick off with an important question. What is your favorite TV show you are watching right now?
Oh, it's going to be disappointing to everybody, but
Huh?
I really don't watch a lot of TV. And if I do, it's like Star Trek reruns, all of them. Or I might watch like Clutterbug or Amy Darley on YouTube to like watch different ways to organize your house or, something like that. I kind of like to putter. So that's really it. I mostly listen to books or podcasts like your versus watching things. Like,
Okay. Well, then I have to ask, what kind of books do you like to listen to? I have personally tried listening to kind of work related books, which I don't always like because I want to have it in my hands and underline and highlight. So I've tried out some different audiobooks. I haven't quite figured out which one's my favorite one type of book to listen to. What do you like to listen to book wise?
well, I have a variety of things that I like to listen to, but I agree. The really work related ones, I like to have it in my hands so I can, yeah, make notes and go back and look. I don't know. There's something about that kind of visceral experience that helps me, and because you're reading it for a different reason. But I'll listen to a good self help book, or I'll
Okay.
listen. I really like mysteries. I like historical fiction. Sometimes I'll listen to biographies of people I'm interested in. So,
Okay.
really anything that I don't have to be super engaged in, because I'm usually listening to a book when I'm going on a walk or doing dishes or folding laundry or cleaning up my office. So, I don't really, anything that takes a whole lot of concentration. I like to like
Okay.
sit down and read. But yeah, otherwise it's just sort of keeping my mind busy so that I stay focused. Yeah.
I love that. All right. Well, in one sentence, how would your colleagues describe you in your school psych role or your LEP role?
I had to ask around about this because I was like, I don't know. So I did. It was kind of fun actually. We all kind of got together and described each other. So it was really fun to think about what I like about my colleagues. And then it was really nice to hear about how they described me. And the biggest thing that came back in terms of how they described me was that I'm a listener.
Mm.
So I was really happy to hear that because usually I'm such a talker. So I like that, but I do like to listen. And and then they said all the nice things like up to date and knowledgeable and child centered and all those things you want to hear that you are as a psychologist. But the thing that stood out to me and made me maybe feel the most pleased was being called a listener because I really see myself as a talker. So
Well, how long have you been in the field of school psychology? And at what point in your journey did you know you wanted to dive into private practice as an LEP?
I've been a school psychologist for almost 25 years, which is hard to say out loud. Like, wow, it's really been that long. And But I kind of love it. It just doesn't feel like it's that long. It always feels new. I know you know too. As a
Yeah.
school psych, you always feel like you're new in your field. There are always new things to learn. There's exciting new ways to look at things. I'm constantly updating my report. At some time, you think you're going to be done updating your report, but you're never done updating your report. And you don't want to be. You read something, you go, oh, I'm stealing that. That was good. And I love that part of it. I knew way back in 2010 that I wanted to be independent, but my kids were little and I didn't want to take that kind of time away from them. And I really just actually took a step back from being a school psych for a couple of years. I didn't even do any contract work or anything. And then I got back working for a district and I did that for about 7 years and went, yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready to be independent. So yeah, I think I knew all along that I wanted to be more independent. I started out entrepreneurial. I started out as a dyslexia intervention tutor back in the 90s when nobody recognized dyslexia. So I started my own business and it was crazy because it was a niche that nobody was filling. So it was wonderful.
Hmm.
But that made me interested in becoming a credentialed school psychologist. At that time, it was just educational psychology and neurodevelopmental stuff and kind of I wasn't credentialed, but it made me really want to be. And then it just sort of went from there. I really liked being able to do my own thing.
Right. Well, and one of your own things have to do with working a lot with families. So tell me about your experience consulting and coaching parents and families.
Well, one of my favorite parts of being a school psych right from the beginning was collaborating with my colleagues. Really, I came into a district where I was one of three psychs, and one of those psychs was part time. So my collaboration was with the teachers and the OTs and the SLPs and physical therapists and general ed teachers and principals and special ed administrators. I mean, we had to be kind of a collaborative team because we were all supporting each other. It was a small district. And within that, we would really sit and problem solve with families. And sometimes in larger districts, you don't get that opportunity to do that. So it was really a privilege to start out that way. And it established this idea that we're just on this team of trying to figure out how do we help maximize this kid's abilities and
Mm.
get them to where they need to go. And I worked in a county office, so it really was about maximizing their abilities. It was a lot of kids with severe disabilities. And so it wasn't, I know that, we have to be careful saying that word as school psychs, but really when you're working with a severely disabled population, that's what you're trying to do. And
Mhm.
it was a wonderful progress working with families, working with colleagues and learning about how to bring about change on a team of people. And then that just over the years, especially if you're in a bigger district, it's a smaller team. You're usually just with your team that's at that school. And the parents were sometimes left out of the process, maybe because they self elected out or because they didn't really know how the process worked. And one of my favorite things was just bringing them in at the very beginning, telling them exactly how the process was going to go, and then listening to them about what was going on and what their ideas were for fixing it and why. And then that just gives you a place to start. And it was such a great experience. And I still love it. I love it. It's like a little problem solving team. And everybody wants the best for this student. So I really enjoy that process.
Well, you had mentioned that some parents self elect. You've been in schools where inviting parents in isn't always part of the process. It seems very important to you. So, why have you found that working with parents and families is that important piece that seemed to be missing?
Well, we're kind of called experts in our field, and we are, especially after some years of experience and a variety of different settings. We do become always growing experts in our field about cognition, about how students learn, about how to support students. But parents bring to the table being an expert in their particular child. And there is no way we could ever be that. And so if you can think of, if you can help them to understand that coming to the table as the expert in their child they're bringing a piece of the puzzle that we could never have on our side, no matter how good we are at our job. So I think that parents sometimes forget that they bring that to the table, and sometimes school teams forget that parents bring that to the table. We might not know what is good in a school setting, but without the parent input and without that parent participation, we don't know what's best for that child in the school setting. So I think it's an important piece. And it doesn't mean that, I know I can hear administrators in my mind right now saying, parents just can't get everything they want, but that's not what they're bringing to the table. I mean,
Mhm.
sometimes you might get the odd parent who is, but what they're bringing to the table is they're terrified for their child's future, and they're really wondering what can happen, and probably worried a little bit about how they contributed to this and they may have gone wrong. So there's like guilt and self-doubt, and then worry for their child, and then concern that they're going to have to fight because that's what they've heard. And I mean, they're bringing a lot to the table. And if we don't respect that, then it's hard to meet them where they are and bring them on board as team members. And once they're on board with you and it's collaborative, it's magical, like what can happen with the team. So, I mean, it just that experience alone can turn around recalcitrant team members. It can be an incredibly engaging experience for the whole team where you feel like you really are working for the good of this child. It can be very rewarding. So that whole process is really important to me. And working with and if to separate it out as from the school setting,
Mhm.
sometimes parents just need to know that it's going to be okay. And they need to hear it's going to be okay and how it's going to be okay. And they're often relieved to know, okay, all this strife and drama we've been dealing with because our child's having difficulties, with the help of this team, we might actually make this child stronger and more capable. They start to believe it. And then that's a very exciting time to be working with parents.
Well, what advice would you give to all of the professionals working in special education who they themselves want to enhance their communication and rapport with parents?
Well, I mean, it can sometimes be pretty situation dependent. However, I think it all starts with listening.
Mhm.
Parents come to us with their stories. By the time they've gotten to us, whether we're an LEP or we're a school psych at an elementary school, they've been through it. They have been worried about their kid. They've been scared. They've been judged. They are feeling real pain for their kid for the most part. I mean, I'm talking about in generalities, I realize, but most of the time they just really have a deep fear and they're afraid of not doing something right. And so for us to be able to listen to them all the way through, don't worry about what they're saying. Just seek to really understand what they're saying. Try not to imagine what the implications are. Try
Mm.
not to imagine what your response is going to be. Hear them out, maybe clarify where things are a little vague, maybe get more details if something doesn't seem right to you, but don't question them. Make sure you are in complete understanding. And there are two reasons. One, you get amazing information when you do this because the more you allow them to talk and let them know it's a judgment free space and you're not going to try to deny them anything, they're going to open up to you and you're going to find out so much about this student. But it also builds this rapport because they're finally being heard and understood, and they are really like de-escalated from that almost
Mm.
always. I mean, you can get some of the most escalated parents and you sit down and say, tell me your story. Start from the beginning and tell me what's happened. It does take time. I know it does, but it cuts off all the time at the end where things are a problem. So it's time you're
Mhm.
putting in at the beginning. You're de-escalating them. You're helping them move into a much more resourceful place for problem solving versus thinking they're going to have to fight you. So once they know you're going to listen to them, you're going to take them at their word, because unless you've got a real cuckoo parent, and I know they exist in 25 years, I've met a few, but it's so rare that they all stick in my mind. The kind of everyday parent you deal with isn't cuckoo. They they're just frustrated, and hearing a
Mhm.
frustrated person all the way through is an amazing way to de-escalate them. And now, once they felt heard and you're validating them, now they'll partner with you. And they might just partner with you, but as you show trust in your team members, they bring that trust. They come along with you because they trust you. So they think, and so now you have to manage that, right? I mean, that's part of it, is just saying, hey, you have to be a spokesperson for the parents on your school team, but you're also a spokesperson to the parent for the school team sometimes if they don't have a good relationship with them. And I know, look, I worked in a big district where I had a huge caseload, where people, a full-time psych would be doing 120 assessments, 130 assessments. I mean, I was part-time and I was doing 60. So it's a lot. And I understand that. But, and really, you don't have to go super deep with all the parents. A lot of the parents just kind of get it and don't need this level, but you'll know the ones who do. And it's worth the time. What I've learned, it's worth the time, because now you've built a partnership with that parent. I had parents when I worked in the district who I didn't even have anymore. They'd moved on to different schools, and they'd call me and say, "Can you help me with this?" And I loved that. I mean, I didn't love the time suck that could be sometimes, but that meant that they really trusted me, and that was important to me, because they needed to have somebody to trust so that they could get their concerns heard and understand that the school is listening to them. It's all about that relationship building and building trust. You get a lot less due process and IEEs and fair hearings when there's a relationship and a foundation of trust between the school and the parents.
So listening, definitely one of those skills to really be working on. And what I heard too, when we think about actionable steps, is making sure that you have the time set aside when you're having those conversations. I know a lot of times, whether we're having one-on-one conversations, or I think a lot of, the team meetings we have with families. I guess I'm curious because, like you mentioned, you've been in large school districts where we got huge caseloads. How did you kind of navigate that with, sometimes we only have 20 minutes for this meeting, or we only have an hour for an IEP meeting? How did you balance that need and desire to be partnering with the parent and have that listening ear, and at the same time, logistics?
Sure. Well, logistics are no joke. Like, that's true. And this isn't every family, right, that you're
Okay.
dealing with, luckily. I went to a school where there were a lot of high need parents. I always felt like we needed like parent IEPs. It was a high achieving school, and the parents had a lot of ideas about what was going on with their kids. And we would get special ed referrals if kids were getting like a 2 minus, in reading, and, something like so. There was a lot of conversation that went into that where it would derail a special education referral. But here's when I really would do it. I would say, can you stay after school to talk? Like, if I didn't have an IEP or an SST to go to, because they usually had kids, the kids would go out and play on the playground, and the parent and I would stand there, and while the kids were playing, and then we would have these conversations. So it wasn't over a desk and I'm taking copious notes. I would like have a notepad with me, on the picnic table or something, where I'd be like, hey, I want to write that down because I don't want to forget it. But mostly, it's really, most of the information you're hearing isn't something that's actionable. It's really just they need to be heard, because they've been denied a lot of times, right? I don't think my kid's doing well in reading. Your kid is fine. You know what I mean? They hear that. Your kid is fine. They're just a slower developer. We don't test kids in late kindergarten. Like, we just, and so this parent has run up against already a lot of denials of their concern. So all you have to do is not deny their concern. You don't have to take all that information in and make use of it. And the truth is, they're not 100% of what they're saying isn't necessarily true anyway. That doesn't matter, because it's their perception of what is true. And so it might not be what happened at all, but it's their perception. And if you don't validate that, hear them all the way through, understand what's behind that perception, you're not going to be able to de-escalate it or address it. So sometimes
Mhm.
it's just the listening and they get it out. And sometimes they hear themselves talk and they think, okay, well, maybe not that. But, so they're de-escalating themselves. So
Mhm.
it's just a great way to solve problems without having to, it's working smarter, not harder. So now all you're doing is standing around from 3:30 to 4 while the parent watches their kids play in the playground after school and listening to what they have to say. And I think it's going to be helpful on the back end of that IEP when you need to
Mhm.
come with recommendations and you need to understand how this child's disability, if they have one, applies. Or if they don't have one, how their strengths are bolstering them. And you're not going to know that if you don't have good conversation with the parents.
Well, and that kind
So,
of leads me to my next question around what insights do you have for school psychologists and other educators on handling those difficult conversation with parents, especially when we're addressing some very sensitive topics. You've already brought up some things. Parents are walking in, maybe thinking how they might have contributed to these difficulties, this guilt, this shame. But a lot of times the concerns we're talking about are also very sensitive behavioral concerns, learning challenges. Any tips?
well, simple honesty, assuming you've gone through this period of listening to the parent, simple honesty really goes a long way. You're not going to tell this parent anything that they haven't already been thinking. So, like if you've got a child who you've tested them in the first grade and their IQ is 71, this parent isn't surprised,
Mm.
right? You're not telling them something they don't know. I think what happens is we say your child has an intellectual disability or your child is mentally ill and has this emotional disturbance. Those are the really difficult ones, right? They're already experiencing it. So really you're kind of validating them. And their pushback is almost always going to be, so then what does this mean? He doesn't get to go to school or he doesn't get
Mm.
to be in his classroom or he doesn't, they're already thinking, oh, you're putting this label on my kid. And the kind of the parents that we're concerned about, right? You're putting a label on this kid who, and now he's not going to be able to get things that I think he should be able to get. I mean, that's where their minds are going. Most of the time, they're relieved. I mean, that's been my experience, Jenny. I don't know about you. When you've had to tell parents this information, they're almost always relieved to hear it.
Mhm.
Like there's finally a name for what's going on, and somebody's validating, like, thank you. I knew there was something going on. So it's not as hard as you think, but come with recommendations and solutions.
Mm.
And if you've talked to them and listened to them, you know what recommendations and solutions are going to land, and you know how to phrase them to help the parent understand what the meaning is behind them. So if you're talking about putting a kid in an SDC and the parent's going to be a little bit resistant to it, then you can come to the table with, we need them to be in this classroom for the real functional learning they need. However, here are the ways we're going to keep them integrated in their classroom. So like how to address it with a parent who's got some real concerns. I mean, there are always going to be people who are adversarial, but you cut that number down a lot by being collaborative and listening and validating. Yeah.
As you were sharing that, it made me think of this one parent in particular who is stuck in my head 25 years into this field, was early on in my career. And I remember this because I needed to tell the parent that their child was eligible now under intellectual disabilities. And I had been in
Oh, yeah.
elementary school psych. I have said that to kindergarten parents. I've even said that to first grade parents. This was a fifth grade parent. This was something that in my mind, I was like, "Ooh, why haven't we said these words yet?" Like, we need to really, like
Right.
you said, be honest. This is what we're seeing here. And I was so nervous about the conversation with the parent, and as I'm going through and explaining kind of what we're finding and then giving that name, I'll never forget the moment the mom just looked at me and she goes, "Yeah, I already knew that." And I was like, "Oh, okay, we're all on the same page." And just going back to exactly what you're saying, a lot of times we're just putting a name to something. The parent knew exactly what was going on with her child. I was just
Yes.
needing for like an official piece of paper to give a certain name to this. And yeah, it was just so much anxiety on my part and such a sense of relief that exact moment where she just looked at me and she was like, I already know that about my child. It's like, okay, okay, yeah,
Right. We're making prejudgments that there's some kind of problem with this. But
yes,
I know as a parent, I'm happy to hear, when my kid's really sick and has a rash and we don't know what's going on. And the doctor says, well, they have this. And you're just like, oh, thank goodness there's a reason. And we don't have to
right,
just keep wondering like what's happening right now. So
yeah.
it's relieving to know. And that I think as a new school psych, that might be hard to understand. And that, I mean, I was just as scared as every other psych the first few times that had to happen.
Yeah.
And especially because in a county office, we had preschoolers who were, they were in an SDC preschool because of communication difficulties or whatever. And then we're doing their big transition assessment to kindergarten. And you really found, oh boy, this goes way deeper than a communication assessment. And, they really are. And their ID, they're maybe not going to be able to handle a typical kindergarten as we would expect, or we might be looking at an 8, or we might, I mean, and you think, oh my gosh, this is the first time ever these parents have heard it, and maybe it is, but they're not ever surprised. I can't think of one time. I mean, I've been at this a long time. I can't think of once where a parent was like, "What? No way!" The only time they've ever said that is when it comes to the services part.
Okay.
I've right. I've never heard them say it when it came to the eligibility. I mean, the only time I've really seen parents be upset is when a child isn't eligible. And that's a real tricky
Mhm.
situation too, right? When I think that's probably the hardest one of all, when you have a parent who has an expectation of eligibility because they think they're going to get their kids some extra help and the child doesn't meet eligibility. I think that's probably the trickiest one.
Well,
Um,
and I think going back to something that you shared before, you had mentioned, let's come to meetings with solutions and recommendations. And I think, again, reflecting back early on in my career, you know, no fault of just me being a newer school psychologist, sometimes at those beginning meetings in those first couple of years, if the child was not eligible, there was just a period at the end of that sentence. And then it was just kind of
yep.
like, thanks for coming. And so now from the perspective is, okay, but what did we learn about your child, whether they're eligible or not, whether we're going to have an IEP of 504 or just talk about what did we learn? And from this, what are some suggestions that we can provide in the home setting, in the school setting? But yeah, early on, I mean, I think we all cringe when we think back to our early on versions of ourselves as school psychologists and, you know, things we said and things we wish we could have
Thank
taken
goodness those reports are lost forever, right? Like, I don't know what
25
they
years
have to,
ago.
I never have to look at them. Right. Those kids have moved on. We don't ever have to
We have.
revisit that. Yeah, I can't imagine. But it's funny because, back to those kids who don't qualify. Yeah, that was just the check, moving on. And that is, you and Amy were talking about the last couple podcasts, like a few podcasts ago, about the prim. I mean, I lived and died by that saying early on. Like, here's an entire page or two of interventions and things that might work to help for. I mean, you could like look up the most intricate things in that. I loved that thing. And I forgot that it existed, frankly. And I'm so glad it's still around because that is really, as a psychologist, right up there with the, prepared school psychologist. You also wish to have the prim because there'll be those kids who don't qualify and those parents just want to know what to do about it. And it's nice to be able to come with solutions. So yeah, I'm going to add that into my recommendations. Get the prim or get access to it. I'm sure it must be online by now, but yeah.
And for those of you who didn't check that episode out with Amy and I talking about MTSS, I will make sure to put a link to the PRIM, the Pre-Referral Intervention Manual, in this show notes as well.
That
So
was
for
a
the
great episode, by the way.
oh,
So
thank you. For those working in special education, what practical steps can someone take to empower parents to be those advocates for their children? I know a lot of times we use the word advocate it can have some interesting meanings to it. But of course,
Yeah, when you're a school psych, it does for sure.
that can bring some fear into our hearts, but we want parents to be there advocating for their children. That's like you said,
Mhm.
they're the people who know this child the best. So
Yeah.
what are those like tips and strategies to help empower those parents?
Well, outside of the unique situation for whatever parent you're dealing with, I think the first kind of practical thing that I can recommend to a parent is, as best as you can, leave the emotion at the door. Not that you shouldn't feel passionate about your child, but the emotion clouds, it's a filter, right? So you're maybe not reading the social cues in the room, and you're not seeing what people have to say because you're kind of clouded by your own perceptions. So leave that emotion at the door. And I recommend this, by the way, to, when I'm coaching teachers or when I'm coaching school principals, or leave it at the door. Just like I literally tell them, picture taking your suit of emotion off and leaving it at the door. You can pick it right back up when you go out. You don't have to leave it forever. It's just in this compartmentalized little scenario. It allows you to hear more, and it keeps lines of communication open. And then I encourage parents to write down all the questions they have,
Mm,
maybe leaving the statements out other than specific information about your child. Definitely share
mhm,
that. But statements and opinions about the state of things, I
mm,
think that should be addressed. But the IEP meeting isn't necessarily where to address that. You're not going to get traction there. But talking to the special ed director or the special ed administrator, or the principal and the leaders in the special ed team, that's where you get your traction with that. Because the IEP meeting is such a structured legal meeting, it's okay that you have opinions about things, but definitely keep it about your child. But write down your questions. So if you have an opinion about, I think my child should have a one-on-one aid, and the fact that you're not giving it to me is because you don't want to spend the money, right? That's a common one. The question would be, I really feel like a one-on-one aid is the situation that would be the best support for my child. I'm wondering, what is the barrier to that? Why are we,
mm,
what is the problem with that? What is the reason to not provide that? Ask the question. You're still getting it out there, but now you might get some feedback because you're going to
mhm,
hear the school psychologist going to tell you the research about one-on-one aids and how they aren't necessarily the best solution because children become dependent, or because it's keeps them separate from their peers, or I mean, there are a lot of reasons why one-on-one aids don't work, and there are a lot of reasons why they do. And sharing that with
mhm,
parents, sometimes they've never heard it. I've had parents, when they come and ask me for a special ed referral because they think their child who can't needs a one-on-one aid, and that has happened more than one time. And you have to just say, you understand that special education is a narrowing and reduction of education to focus in on specific foundational skills to improve those, and so that they have reasonable growth. But we're actually narrowing and reducing their education to do that. And a special education aid is like the highest restriction. And
mhm,
they don't know that. They're like, I don't want special ed. I just want help for my kid. Okay,
mhm.
well, then now we have a different conversation. That's so
Yeah.
helpful to know, right? So having parents be clear about the questions and writing them down ahead of time, and then not leaving without addressing them, like check them off. Because there will be a point in the meeting when they say, do you have any other questions? You can be like, here it is, and roll out your scroll and go down, and that's what they're there for. And then I would always recommend bringing a second set of ears.
Mhm,
So bringing dad along, bringing grandma along, bringing your best friend along. They don't have to be educators or advocates, or they can just be somebody else who knows your child and cares about what happens. They're going to hear things you don't.
mm,
Their emotion, I mean, even dads, and or the other parent, right? You have the passionate parent, and then you have the other parent who's just sort of listening. They usually don't come both in, super passionate. So having a second set of ears helps. And then If things have been adversarial, I would recommend for a parent to find that one team member they trust. Maybe it was the second grade teacher who was the first to raise the issues. Maybe it was, the school counselor who you happen to know separate from the school, or, somebody you trust on that school team. I would recommend sitting down with them and asking for input about school culture, school climate, so that you have a general idea of, because almost always those people are going to say, we really care about what happens to your kid. And, I think if we just sit down and talk about it, sometimes they can be the ones to talk them down. Now, it can also go the other way and they kind of spool it up, but it's rarer. I mean, I've been at it a long time, and mostly I see that if parents have at least one trusted member, and I've had parents even say, is it okay if I bring his second grade teacher into this meeting as sort of a person to listen and maybe give some input? And I know that there are teams who say, no, don't do that. But absolutely, the parent can bring in whomever they like, because they need somebody there who they feel is on their side if they think the entire team is against them. And if it can be somebody from the school that they have a relationship with, that only helps the team. So that's another recommendation I make. I mean, it's situation dependent. I wouldn't make that recommendation for everybody. And if you are asking as a parent for something you're not going to get, you think you're not going to get, like that one-on-one aid, develop the counter argument. Try to imagine why you're not getting it. Don't think about cost, because that's almost not the reason. If the team really believes that your child needs something, nobody on that team, except for the special ed director or the program specialist, cares at all about what it costs. Wouldn't you say that's true?
I would say most of the time, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And even and if you have a good admin team, they don't care either. I mean, they're worried about how to make it work. I agree. I mean, they've got a lot on their shoulders to do that, but that's what they're concerned about. They're not concerned about, like, well, no, we're just not going to pay for that.
Right.
That's rare, honestly. And maybe I've just had limited experience, but I've worked in a fair amount of districts. Even as an IEE, I don't see that very often. It's really just about, how are we going to make that happen? Oh my gosh, that autism class is full. What are we going to do? It's not, we're not going to do it. So develop your counter argument, and then, be ready to address that when they tell you things. And then also, while you're developing the counter argument, and here's the tricky part, is then the parents start seeing, like, oh, maybe that isn't a good thing. When they start doing their own research. So that's helpful. And reminding the team that you are the expert in your child. That you respect that they're experts in their field, and that you're an expert in your child, and you want to bring that to the table so that you guys can collaborate and support. So,
and I think, as you were sharing some of those tips and strategies, makes me think about, from the educator's point of view, how can they ready parents for those types of things? And so I know, asking parents, what questions do you want to make sure we answer in today's meeting, is typically one of the first things we ask in our IEP meetings. And so letting parents know prior to the meeting starting, hey, we're going to ask you this question, so that they have that opportunity to think through some of those different pieces. And, one of the things I think about is, even when we go around the table and people are introducing themselves and, their different roles, sometimes I've heard parents say things like, well, I'm just the parent. Right, after we have all these people who are talking about all of their credentials and all, not that we are listing off all of them, but, there's a lot of people sitting around people who have a lot of background and education. And so I always have that moment where I'm listening for that, where a parent, like, I'm just the parent. And I'm always like, you are the expert on your child here. And so sharing with them, that is the role that you get to take on in this meeting here.
And they're really the person on the team who has the most influence on the team, and other than the child themselves, because they are the advocate for their child, who is the student that is the purpose for the meeting. And it's not that the whole team isn't advocating for their child. They are. Most of the teams I've worked on, I mean, really, almost all of them, have been really child-centered, and they really do want what's best for that kid. And it's interesting, because I think parents see themselves as a less powerful member of the team. Like you said, just the parent. but they're really kind of the most powerful person on that team.
Yeah.
They have the most ability to influence and help us understand their child. So it's an interesting perspective. Yeah, you're right. They do say that. It's heartbreaking, really.
It is. It is. I have that sometimes too with students who will say, well, I'm just a practicum student, or I'm like, oh, wow, you are a practicum student. Like I think we need to take the word just out of our language sometimes. Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah.
Well, from your perspective, what role does a school psych play in building a strong homeschool connection, especially for our students who do have behavioral or social emotional needs?
Well, I mean, the most important piece of this is trust. The homeschool connection has to be built out of trust for it to be effective. And this means that when the school is bringing something to the parents can hold in their mind that the school is coming from the position of, you know, we're trying to be supportive of your child and be communicative with you. And, even if it might be information you don't like. And on the other side, when parents make requests, the schools have to be transparent about what they're doing and why, or what they haven't done and what they're
Mhm.
going to do to remedy it. And I know sometimes in districts, it can sound like doublespeak when they have the sort of lines that they're supposed to say, right? Like, we provide a collaborative team building. Did you feel like you participated? Do you know all these like
Yeah.
particular things that we say in districts? It sounds like doublespeak and it sounds confusing to parents. I mean, they've told me this directly. And Jenny, from working on the IEE side,
Mhm.
you hear it and you just think, oh yeah, that sound the district is doing what they need to do. So I it's a litigious culture, and so they're doing what they need to do to protect themselves, and I don't have a problem with that. And I hope the parents don't either. And I try to coach the parents on the IEE side. Look, they've got a long history of having to be very careful about the words that come out of their mouths. This
Mhm.
isn't about them trying not to be trying to hold something back from you. They're protecting themselves. Your best bet is to make them understand that they don't need to do that they can be honest with you. And so that's why the relationship part is a key. From the very first contact, parents need to feel like they can trust what their school is telling them. And if the school messes up and says, oh boy, you know what, he was supposed to have counseling and we didn't start it, and we're 4 weeks into the school year, here's what we're going to do for compensatory. Don't make the parent come to you. Or
Mhm.
if the parent does come to you, don't say, well, there was a holiday and then there was this. Just say, oh, we need to look at this and develop a plan to address it. So I think it's on both sides. There has to be accountability, and there has to be some grace, and there
Mhm.
has to be a lot of civil conversation, because that builds the trust. And parents get that schools have limitations. So if the school's honest about it and talks about what they're going to do to address those barriers, and they're transparent, that just builds trust. So now the next time something happens, the parent's going to have a little bit more trust that
Mhm.
there's going to be a solution, and they can trust the professionals they're working with.
Love that. Well, both you and I have been in the field for quite a while, but when you reflect back when you were starting out in this field, what advice would you give to someone else who is just starting out? Maybe they're finishing up that first year or they're finishing up grad school. What advice would you give for this amazing field?
Yeah, I think I would start with slow down. You don't have to know everything.
Mhm.
You just have to know how to find things out. And that's where spending a lot of time talking to experienced special educators, OTs, speech therapists, other psychologists really comes into play. Slow down. It's okay. There's time enough. You're going to get it done. So don't be frenetic. So when I say slow down, obviously you can't slow your pace of work. It is what it is. You just get it. But you can slow down your thinking about it. You can bring that frenetic energy, that frenetic feeling that we all get. I've been at this a long time and I still get it. Jenny, you've heard it
I
from
do.
me. So it's it happens.
Mhm.
But you get better and better as you go along at going, okay, I need to slow down. I need to take this one thing at a time. That's all you can do.
Yeah.
And I think it will bring that stress level down. When you're the first 3 to 5 years as a psych can be extremely stressful.
Yes.
And then the other part, I think, is when you have time, that weird lull that can sometimes happen where you're, between a bunch of cases and you find yourself with an hour and a half of like between meetings and you don't have anything urgent to do and you just don't have the energy to look at any more reports. Go into classrooms. Just go in, just go hang out. Go hang out in the special education preschool class you support, or go hang out in that second grade classroom that seems to be giving you a lot of referrals. Just go hang out. Let yourself be seen. See what the classroom's about. See what's happening. See what the teachers are doing. Go to some of their trainings. Go to the staff meetings. Offer to do recess duty once or twice just to understand the culture of your region, of your school.
Mm.
It's so helpful. It's so helpful when you have to create a behavior plan to have sat in a classroom for a period of time
Mm.
and understand how it all works. So embed yourself into the culture of the school. And I know this is hard. I worked 3 days a week and I had 3 schools. So it's not like
Oh, wow.
there was a lot of time, right? So sometimes it really is about, I have 20 minutes. You don't need to sit in your office and answer emails. Do that after school. Go into a classroom and see what's going on and let them see you
Mhm.
watching and helping and observing. It's being present in the classrooms is an amazing way to build trust with the staff you're working with. So those would be the two maybe biggest pieces.
I love that. I love that. I will say, since I'm not always on school settings at anymore, that is probably one of the things I miss the most is literally just being in classrooms.
You
Um,
too.
there's definitely those moments where I've had those 20-minute breaks that I went to go sit in a kindergarten classroom just to go sit and see happiness in schools and just to see or go hang out on the kindergarten playground just to see kids playing and be happy and things like that. But I love being in teachers' classrooms. I think you learn a lot about how teaching happens. And for me, it's one of the places I've seen some like just really great teaching.
Well, and to piggyback off that comment about being in classrooms, Jenny, I think one of the great things is it makes you a better psychologist when it comes down to recommendations.
Mm.
And I know that recommendations are often an afterthought in a report. And I've been, as a person who does IEEs, I'm reviewing a lot of reports and I'm often stunned at how many reports have no recommendations
Mm.
at the end. Or the recommendation is that the IEP team review the assessment. But recommendations is that's where we put all of that work we did in the report that probably, besides the parent, not very many people are reading.
Yeah.
That's where the magic can really happen. And one of the ways to give effective recommendations besides the prim and ChatGPT is just being in the classroom so that your recommendations are specific for that child at that moment. So yeah, it's such a great thing to do. And it's fun. So why not?
I love it. I love it. I always remember when, I always went out of my way to observe students before I pulled them in for evaluation so that they didn't quite know I was in there for them. And sometimes it might have been just I observed and then I pulled the kid, like literally 2 seconds later, now I'm pulling the kid. So sometimes I would have those questions from the students themselves of, why were you in my classroom? Or I remember you were in my classroom. And my response back was always, I just was wondering what it was like to be in your classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
I think is a very truthful statement. Yes, I'm taking furious notes and jotting down 9 million other things. But that's to me one of the senses I'm trying to get is what is it like
Yep.
to be in this classroom? And when you're staring at one student in particular or double checking against 2 or 3 other students, that to me is one of the perspectives I'm taking. What is it like for this student to be in this classroom? And that's been just a helpful perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. I often don't get to observe a child until I've seen them because, I'm it's usually we're just trying to set everything up, and that's just how it works. But that's the thing that we tell them is we're there to see what your classroom looks like what you're dealing with as a student
Yes.
in your classroom. That's true. I mean, yeah, I'm also doing an interval observation, and I'm looking at how your sustained attention and all of that. But also, yeah, it's true, and you can do it even when you're not observing a student. Yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, this podcast, as we all know, is called the Prepared School Psych Podcast. When you think of the term prepared, what do you do to help yourself feel more prepared in your roles?
Well, you have to stay up to date on the law and how it's interpreted. So, as an LAP, we have to do that every 2 years. But as a school psych, we didn't have to. But when those trainings were available, I would take them. It's worth it to go and hear what a special education attorney has to say about what trends are in litigation for special education. It's just important to know so
Mhm.
that when you're doing reports, you're writing them in the most defensible way you can, and that you're learning and staying on top of what the newest trends are in testing, and whether that applies to you or doesn't, you still should know about it. And so I think that's probably something to think about, and not something I thought about for maybe the first 5 years. And then when I remember being in an IEP, I worked for a county office, so I would go to IEPs in about 5 different districts. And being in one district where they were talking about, how it was just before SEIS was coming in. I mean, it was kind of as it was coming in, but we were lagging behind, and I kept hearing about it. And then it became the reports changed once SEIS came into being. So I was seeing these reports that were much more detailed with very particular language that I hadn't seen before, right? I mean, this was somewhere around 2009, 2008, when that was really starting to get going, when we were going from the handwritten to the SEIS, and just being flabbergasted at some of these reports because they didn't look anything like mine. And then finally just going, I better check this out, and realizing, oh my gosh, there are a lot of things have changed and I'm not keeping up with it. Like, it was
Mhm.
stunning. And so from then on, every couple of years I would go and update. And I think it's valuable. But outside of that, having a good tracking system is essential.
Mm.
So many pieces. We have so many pieces, and you can be in so many different places for each kid. So having a good tracking system that keeps you efficient, thorough, timely, and it'll get blown completely apart from time to time. But it's good to have somewhere to start and know how to collect all the pieces back together. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today and for sharing all of this wonderful knowledge with all of our listeners. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Tracie.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it. I felt privileged to be able to come and be a part of this amazing podcast. So thank you.
Well, and to all of our listeners, we appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe for more resources, expert interviews, and practical strategies. Until next time, everyone. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.